All right. This is being recorded, so if you have happened upon this live stream and you don't have time in your schedule this afternoon to watch it, it's being recorded and it will be uploaded as soon as possible. So, hello everybody. Again, my name is Rima McCoy Heighton, and I am one of the co-founders of the Lois Curtis Center in Topeka, Kansas. We've been around for about a year and thought it might be a good idea to invest a little time um, in elaborating and unpacking what we call the Lois Curtis way as far as how we frame disability. Because if you have any familiarity with the Lois Curtis Center and or myself and or the other co-founder, Amy Heighton, you know that we do disability very differently from the norm. And so thought it'd be a good idea to talk about why we do that and why it's an imperative. We need more people talking about disability in what we call the Lois Curtis way. And so hopefully this next hour or so will offer some grounding and some context to help flesh out why it's so important to offer a more holistic understanding of what disability is, how marginalization occurs within the disability community, and who is the most impacted by that. So, we're going to, as is the case with pretty much any content that comes out of the Lois Curtis Center, we're going to cover a lot of ground in a very short period of time. What do we mean when we say services supports guidance and resources at the intersection of systemic racism and disability? There's a lot there, and it is long overdue time for emphasis to be brought at this particular intersection. Who, what, where, when, why is hashtag big disco. We'll talk about that. And then a lot of times, folks that have some familiarity with the Lois Curtis Center like to refer to us as a disability justice organization. We do not identify as a disability justice organization, and in fact, a lot of what we do is not what you would find typically at your average everyday disability justice organization. Why do we do what we do, and why does it differ from disability justice organizations? So we're going to unpack that and fall into a whole bunch of rabbit holes, or at least peer into several during our next hour together. Thank you for those of you who are either tuning in live or are going to tune in once the recording is made available. Before we get into all of that stuff, let's talk about Lois, who Lois Curtis was. Um, so on November 3rd of 2022, Lois Curtis died. So Lois Curtis is, along with Elaine Wilson, and their attorney, Sue Jameson, through the Georgia Legal Aid, took on the state of Georgia, basically. And this occurred in 1999. And the Olmstead decision was issued as a result of their efforts. The Olmstead decision was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a Supreme Court justice at that time. And the Olmstead decision affirmed that people with disabilities should be able to live in as least constrictive an environment as possible. Lois and Elaine had spent a strong plurality of their lives in and out of institutions because of their disabilities. And so 1999 Olmstead decision came into fruition, and everybody lived happily ever after in the community setting of their choice, right? No. So Elaine Wilson, who was a woman with disabilities who was white, after Olmsted was able to live successfully in the community, and no longer experienced institutionalization. Lois, a Black woman with disabilities, continued to experience periods of institutionalization after the Olmsted decision came into existence, because as is the case with all disability rights legislation, rules, regulations, the focus is strictly on disability and the barriers that a person experiences to living in the community as a result of the disability that they have. The Olmsted decision, as is the case with all other rules, regulations, et cetera, laws pertaining to disability, offers nothing pertaining to the systemic racism-rooted barriers to community living that racially marginalized people with disabilities experience. And so because of that, Lois continued to experience institutionalization. She once again sued the state of Georgia in 2009. And then after that, she basically single-handedly assembled a support network for herself that assisted her in forming a plan that would result in her being able to live independently in the community for the rest of her life. And she went on to become an artist, and presented her artwork to President Obama in 2011. She was a public speaker who traveled nationally to speak about her lived experience, and was able to, by and large, live successfully in the community. She became ill. She developed cancer. And in late 2022, she did pass away. And unfortunately, despite the fact that Lois was a juggernaut as far as the disability rights movement is concerned, and her efforts led to monumental change and progress for many people with disabilities, she died penniless. And if it were not for a GoFundMe campaign that was set up after she passed away, there would have been no money available to pay for her funeral expenses. So historically, hashtag Big Disco has kind of insinuated that it played a key role in the Olmsted decision. That is actually not true. Lois, along with Elaine and the assistance of Georgia Legal Aid, is what was the impetus for the Olmsted decision. There was not any real significant movement or momentum from any disability network, either at the state or national level, that actively participated in the efforting that led to the Olmsted decision. And we at the Lois Curtis Center, or at least the people that came into creating the Lois Curtis Center after we became aware that Lois had passed away, we wanted to do something that would, one, protect Lois's memory from being whitewashed, and two, in our own small way, create a space that would proactively address the structural barriers that led to Lois experiencing institutionalization, despite the fact that she had been instrumental in the Olmsted decision. And so that is where the Lois Curtis Center came. That impetus is what created the Lois Curtis Center. And for those of you that are listening along, I've got a bunch of images from the Lois Curtis Center, and including our pantry, some images from some events, and school supply drive, an image of a few of the issues of our comic book series called Alliance for Equality. Our most recent edition covers the history of Lois Curtis. And then we've got some kids having fun in the jump house. We've got a few jump houses here. And we see ourselves as being a brick and mortar hub that explicitly and very intentionally exists to provide services, supports, guidance, and resources at the intersection of systemic racism and disability, where scores of people with disabilities exist who are either not eligible for services and supports in a traditional sense, or experience so many structural barriers to accessing them that they might as well not be eligible. We exist for them. We exist explicitly for them, and we are the only disability service provider in the United States at this time that intentionally and openly discusses racism within #BigDisco, racism within the disability community, which the disabled community, whatever you want to call it. If there are disability services and supports being provided, if there are people with disabilities in the space, if there are professionals, advocates who purport to be stakeholders in all things disability, researchers, policy wonks, et cetera, that's where we are scrutinizing, looking for and identifying and speaking out about the gaps that are in all of these nooks and crannies, where multiply marginalized, melanated people with disabilities are falling through, hidden in plain sight in this country. We can't do this work without confronting the status quo on an hourly basis. And so because of that, we intentionally do not receive, nor do we solicit federal, state, or foundation funding, because we are so committed to this mission that we do not want to be impeded in it because of constraints put forth to us by funders. So we do not receive, nor do we solicit federal, state, or foundation funding. So the Lois Curtis Center is committed to addressing how intending to center disability efforts to address society's gaps only actually centers between 5 and 10% of the disability population. What happens to the remaining 90%? Why the disability community only advocates for this small swath of the disability population, and that negatively impacts the disability inclusion of multiply marginalized people with disabilities overall, and ways to begin to ensure that society is operating with a wide enough lens to be inclusive of 100% of disabilities. We're all conditioned to perceive disability in very distinct ways. And people who fall outside of that purview are marginalized and negatively impacted as a result. The Lois Curtis Center is committed to doing what we can to widen that lens, so to speak. And so we're not creating a movement. We're not trying to rally up people to do anything really. We do not organize. We recognize that the role of organizer, to borrow a sentiment that's been making the rounds on social media recently, and it's a very pertinent sentiment. We recognize that the role of organizer comes with a lot of caveats. Organizers, people who identify as community leaders, etc., can abuse the power that comes with those positions. And organizers that are fully committed to the movement's mission, vision, values can oftentimes be exploited. And we do not want to perpetuate either of these dynamics. And so we do not organize. We're not creating a movement here. We provide information for informational purposes only. We affirm that people should not have to assimilate into oppressive systems. And many people cannot assimilate into oppressive systems, even if they want to. We believe that oppressive systems cannot be, quote unquote, reformed, and they must be dismantled. We do not identify as a disability rights or justice organization because rights can be revoked at any time, and therefore rights are unreliable, particularly for multiply marginalized people. And true justice simply cannot manifest in an oppressive system. The Lois Curtis Center was co-founded by two people, Amy Heighton, who is a civil rights attorney and a former National ADAPT and National Council on Independent Living board member. And she's also a former Center for Independent Living, or CIL, director. The other co-founder is moi, Rima McCoy Heighton. I am the ex-commissioner for the Administration on Disabilities. I was the original one for the Biden administration. I am also an ex-NICL board member, as well as the ex-NICL executive director. I used to be a DEI consultant, and I do not do that work anymore. And I am myself, like Amy, a former CIL director. The Lois Curtis Center is not affiliated with the Independent Living Network and or the Independent Living Movement. If you're interested in what independent living is, we've got lots of information about that in our blog. And you can find our blog at www.loiscurtis.org. So let's dive in. The caveats of rights. There are many. We will hit a few here in the next few minutes. But before we do that, let's talk about, let's frame our conversation as far as a few words, a few bits of vocabulary, so that we are using this shared language for the purposes of this particular presentation. So the working definition for disability, as defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act, Friday, July 25th, 2025 is the 35th anniversary of the ADA, by the way. So it defines a person with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And so this can include a few things, including a person that has a bona fide record of an quote unquote impairment, even if they currently do not have at present a disability. It also includes folks who do not have a disability but are regarded, perceived as having a disability. And then it also, the ADA also makes it unlawful to discriminate against a person based on that individual's association with another individual with a disability. So very wide in scope that definition of disability is. Just as a side note, there are a few different definitions of disability at play at the federal level. This is the Americans with Disabilities Act definition. A lot of times when conversation is being had about the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as disability rights legislation in general, it's the framing is a win for people with disabilities is a win for everybody. So I've got a quote here from an article from National Public Radio that affirms that perception. So the ADA offers protection for everybody. In fact, this is an enormous group of Americans, people who don't define themselves as disabled. The person who's in their 80s and moving really slowly and can't manage a flight of steps doesn't think of themselves as disabled. They're just a little older. A person with a mild case of arthritis, a person who can't manage a heavy suitcase when they're traveling. Those are the people who are being helped by the ADA, and it's a large and growing population. And this is not me saying none of that is true. However, we have to keep in mind that it's not the ADA does all those wonderful things, but the ADA is limited in its scope in ways that we don't necessarily talk about, and that we really should. Case in point, the ADA only requires protections in English or American Sign Language, ASL. So if you are a person with a disability, and Spanish is the language that you speak, as far as protections pertaining to the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's no requirement that you receive those in Spanish or whatever language you happen to speak in the US, including languages that are native to this land that we currently refer to as the United States. I often say that the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as a lot of the vast majority, if not all disability legislation, none of it's intersectional. And that nobody ever rolls out the red carpet for REMA when REMA says that. It's true. I do want to emphasize, I do want to be clear, as we are unpacking the shortcomings of the Americans with Disabilities Act, I do not want that to be misconstrued as a edict to just, you know, throw the Americans with Disabilities Act in the trash or not adhere to it, or any other rules, regulations, or laws regarding physical accessibility in public settings. We should comply. We must comply with any and all rules, regulations, laws at every level in this country with regards to accessibility. However, it is incredibly important to keep in mind that affixing a ramp onto a building or something along those lines is not necessarily going to meet the needs of every person with a disability, or even many people with disabilities. So with regards to that, why is that the case? How does that happen? Why is it that we can pretty much across the board guarantee that anytime rights legislation pertaining to disability comes into existence or gets signed into law. Don't anticipate any disability rights legislation being signed into law anytime soon. But whenever that happens, historically, um, you can guarantee that there are going to be wide swaths of the disability population that are not going to necessarily benefit from this legislation. Why is that the case? Well, the vast majority of disability legislation historically has been written by white people, straight, cis, white, non-disabled people, um, written under the advisement of white disability professionals. Again, non-disabled, white, cis, straight, male, who have some adjacency to home and community-based services, or HCBS. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And so implicit bias everywhere. Basically, it gets baked into the legislation. It guides the pen, so to speak. And wherever there is implicit bias, there's exclusion and marginalization and minimalization. Well, it's not here, so we're just going to make do with it, stop complaining. Eventually the rights will trickle down to the rest of you someday. Just be patient and please be grateful that at least we've got this to work with, right? Right. Side note, HIV/AIDS is covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. It almost wasn't. So as the powers that be of hashtag Big Disco were orbiting around the drafting of the Americans with Disabilities Act in the late 1980s, the strategy was, how do we make this as appealing as possible so that it gets signed? And so invariably, conversation turned to, well, we probably don't want it to be inclusive of people who have controversial identities. 1980s, that would be gay people front and center, of course. At that time, HIV/AIDS was known as the quote gay plague, and the thought was that inclusion of HIV/AIDS would jeopardize the passage of the ADA. Howard Moses of Kansas was a gay and disabled advocate who was instrumental in ensuring that ultimately HIV/AIDS was included. Now, as we're kind of gazing into the rabbit hole of disability rights and its caveats, keep in mind that as legislation, as rights, as the status of people with disabilities are being discussed and strategizing is being formulated with regards to how to move the community forward, and kind of the backroom conversation being who are we going to quietly leave behind. As all that's happening, you're hearing there's rhetoric coming from the disability rights movement along the lines of anyone can join the disability community at any time. And so, if we're going to frame things that way, we really should be doing a better job of ensuring that the space is it well, that there's space for absolutely everybody. But the reality is that there's a default setting in the so-called disability community. And so when we're talking about people with disabilities in the US, typically, we're framing things so that if we're not just outright using pictures or showing folks that fit the default setting for a person with a disability. We're alluding to this demographic of people that by and large are white, heterosexual, male, female, gender presenting, middle class, Christian, apparently disabled. So like white guys in wheelchairs and cute white kids in Shriners Hospital commercials, that kind of thing. And people who can access home and community-based services without, extreme amounts of duress. As the late Judy Heumann used to say, it's my body that's disabled, not my mind. That is kind of the battle cry for the default setting of people with disabilities. And so, despite the fact that it's often said that anybody can join the disability community at any time, the more accurate phrasing would be anybody can become disabled at any time. Because being disabled or acquiring a disability does not necessarily guarantee admission into the disability community. That is especially true with regards to the resources that flow into the disability community, the resources that are administered by hashtag Big Disco. What is hashtag Big Disco? Who is it? Where is it? Why is it? How is it? Well, when we came up with the hashtag Big Disco at the Lois Curtis Center, we were referencing kind of several key players, key entity type archetypes, I guess, within what historically has been known as the disability community. So the biggies being the big service providers, the disability agencies like Easter Seals or Goodwill or that kind of thing, that receive billions of dollars in revenue, Medicaid revenue in particular. Home and community-based services, or HCBS, is Medicaid. And in exchange for that revenue, provide direct support professionals to people with disabilities in the community, as well as institutional settings, to assist them in their activities of daily living. We're talking about a $200 billion+ industry. The lion's share by far of that money is coming again from Medicaid, long-term services and supports, and home and community-based services. Additionally, a much smaller pot of that money is as a result of appropriations from the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the Developmental Disabilities Act, Help America Vote Act, etc. These appropriations result in grant funding to places like Centers for Independent Living, developmental disability councils, protection and advocacy agencies, USEDS, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, there are grants from private entities like the Ford Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Chrysalis Foundation. I believe the Hilton Family Foundation does some disability funding, and then other regional and local level foundations. Think of things this way. The disability community is the only marginalized demographic in the United States that receives funding from the government, not only for the Medicaid stuff, services, supports, and activities of daily living, but specifically for individual and systems advocacy. So the Rehabilitation Act funding, Developmental Disabilities Act funding, Help America Vote Act funding manifests in Centers for Independent Living, developmental disabilities councils, protection and advocacy agencies. And one of the things that these entities are mandated to do is advocacy. And so the question begs, how effective can we expect individual and systems advocacy to be if it's paid for by the same system that's doing the oppressing? Something to think about. Long and hard, folks. So the Lois Curtis Center exists beyond hashtag Big Disco's default setting and its funding. Let's talk about what what things look like beyond that. So the disability population in the United States, we're talking about over 55 million people. That's 1 in 5. And depending on whose statistics you're looking at, that statistic can be as high as 1 in 4. Um, with regard to that over 55 million people, we're talking about just over 2.5 million people who use a wheelchair. And we're also only talking about 4.2 million people who are utilizing HCBS or home and community-based services. So again, keeping in mind that big disco, 200 billion plus dollar arena in the US, the lion's share of that money coming from long-term services and supports and home and community-based services reimbursements from Medicaid. We're talking about a massive amount of money, and less than 10% of the disability population in this country is benefiting from these services or tapping into these financial resources. And so for folks that are listening along, I've got several images on the screen right now of people with disabilities that are melanated by and large. We've got an individual who is Muslim. We've got Questlove from The Roots. We've got an indigenous person who is a chair user. We've got a black man and his mom, young black man who is incarcerated. These are images that we typically are not shown in the media or by disability advocates when it's time to do disability advocacy at the state and federal level, and that is not by accident. It's not by accident. And given the statistics that I've just shared with regards to the fact that the vast majority of the financial resources that are moving into big disco, there are some very important questions that if you identify as a stakeholder, or if you are tuned into this presentation and you haven't run off in terror, I would hope that you have some curiosity around. So how does disability show up in society in ways that we haven't been conditioned to perceive? How many disabled people in the US need home and community-based services but experience barriers to obtaining them? What happens, this is super important, what happens to a person with a disability when they don't have access to services? When they can't access services, what do they do? Oh, shoot, I guess, just have to make do. What happens to the millions of people in this country who, like people who are HCBS enrollees, would benefit from HCBS as far as removing some pretty significant barriers to living successfully in the community? Where do they go? What happens to them? We'll come back to that. Back to the ADA real quick. Here are some ADA recognized disabilities that don't necessarily require a ramp to ensure access. And a lot of times the people who experience these ADA recognized disabilities have no other choice but to just suck it up and make do and make the most of situations that they find themselves in that are not accessible and or inclusive to them. Folks with generalized anxiety disorder, for instance, folks with substance addiction, ADHD, borderline personality disorder, PTSD, CPTSD. Trauma causes disability, folks. Trauma exacerbates disability. Chronic pain can be a disability. Long COVID can be a disability. How does disability manifest in areas that veer away from the default setting of the disability community? So people with low income backgrounds are actually 11 times more likely to have behavioral, mental illness, and other disorders, ADA recognized disabilities. With regards to such disparities in child protective services. So a generation ago, a study was conducted where there was a merging of documents from hospitals, foster care settings, law enforcement agencies, and schools, and found that children with disabilities were 3.4 times more likely to experience child maltreatment than children without disabilities. What I'm asking the viewer to consider doing right now is to begin to connect the dots that I'm throwing out to see the picture that's being painted. According to the National Institute on Health, between 40 to 80% of incarcerated juveniles have at least one diagnosable behavioral, mental health, and or other disability or disorder. I say diagnosable because thanks to barriers that exist because of systemic racism, barriers to accessing diagnosing professionals, etc. A lot of juveniles that are incarcerated in juvenile detention facilities don't actually have a diagnosis, or they have an incorrect diagnosis, or something along those lines. Also, 40 to 80%, that's such a huge, huge range. There's such a dearth of accurate diagnosis of kids, minors that land in juvenile detention facilities that this 40 to 80% range is as good as it gets. And you know, even if the number's at the low end of that, we're talking about almost half of kids that are incarcerated in this country experience a disability. This is not stuff you hear from hashtag Big Disco. And then 40% of those juvenile offenders transitioned into becoming adult offenders by the age of 25. Connect the dots and see the picture. Incarcerated individuals, according to the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, produce $11 billion in goods and services annually, but receive pennies an hour for their prison labor. It's the sub-minimum wage issue impacting people with disabilities that Big Disco does not want to touch, folks. Permeating all of this is what are known as ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. And adverse childhood experiences are traumatic or potentially traumatic events that occur during a person's childhood, so birth to 17. And that can be violence, abuse, neglect. It can be personally experiencing these things. It can be witnessing these things happening around us, having a family member attempt or die by suicide. Um, uh, you know, being raised in an environment where there are elements at play that undermine a child's sense of safety, stability, or bonding. And that can include growing up around drug use, so substance abuse issues, um, uh, untreated mental health problems, instability because of parental separation. That includes having one or more parents incarcerated, systemic the issues that plague areas that where people who are low income are predominant, and so on and so forth. ACEs are linked to legal issues, mental illness, substance abuse issues in adolescence, and all of the other maladies that we tend to talk about in isolation with regards to um, quote unquote at-risk youth. ACEs and race. So children of different races and ethnicities do not experience ACEs equally. Imagine that. So 61% of Black kids and 51% of Latina kids have experienced at least one ACE, compared to 40% of white kids and 23% of Asian kids. Don't have information specific to Indigenous kids, which is really an unacceptable gap. Um, and so, again, connecting the dots, seeing the picture, growing up as a racially marginalized child, um, places you at risk of experiencing trauma, as a result of either directly or indirectly the fact that you are a racially marginalized child. We can't have complete conversations about developmental disabilities without talking about trauma, because trauma is there's a growing body of evidence that indicates that trauma is a mitigating factor in developmental disabilities, in the acquisition of developmental disabilities, along with prematurity and low birth weight, prenatal or environmental exposure to drugs, alcohol, tobacco, poor nutrition. If you live in a food desert, you have a higher degree of likelihood of experiencing poor nutrition, exposure to high levels of environmental toxins. Not everybody in Flint, Michigan has safe drinking water 11 years later. Infections in the mother or the pregnant person during pregnancy, or in the baby in early life. And then, of course, trauma and stress. For those of you listening along, I've got a graphic from the Centers for Disease Control, and it shows that approximately 3 out of 10 American Indian and Alaska Native people have a disability. 1 in 4 Black people have a disability. 1 in 5 white people have a disability. 1 in 6 Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders have a disability. 1 in 6 Latinas have a disability, and 1 in 10 Asian folks have a disability. There are a lot of reasons why these numbers might not necessarily be accurate, and that there are cultural considerations with regards to how disability is recognized in particular cultures, of course, but at present, this is our understanding of the statistics as far as racial demographics and where disability manifests. moving further away from the default setting of disability. So, um, people who are melanated, so black and brown people, and disabled are institutionalized more than white disabled people are. This is according to the National Institute on Health. Their research indicates that growth in Black and Latina nursing home use may be the result of disparities in access to home and community-based services. So several slides ago, when I asked, well, my goodness, what happens to people who need home and community-based services and experience barriers to accessing it? Well, institutionalization is one thing that can happen. And melanated people are institutionalized more than white disabled people because there are reasons that are rooted in systemic racism that lead to barriers to melanated people accessing home and community-based services. Because of systemic racism within hashtag Big Disco, there are barriers that melanated disabled people experience, and it leads to them being institutionalized. The Americans with Disabilities Act offers no protections due to race-based disparities in access to services and supports. The Americans with Disabilities Act offers no relief to melanated disabled people who are experiencing barriers to accessing disability services within Big Disco. Nothing. And even when there is access, that doesn't mean that there's quality in that access. So, long-term services and supports, including care received at home and in residential serving settings. So that includes HCBS, even if a person who is melanated and disabled has HCBS, they are experiencing a deteriorated level of quality of service and support in comparison to their white peers with disabilities who are participating in those services as well. These institutional settings where services and supports are being administered are highly racially segregated. Say what? Yes, it's true. Black, Indigenous, and people of color have less access to quality care and report poorer quality of life compared to their white disabled counterparts. Systemic racism lies at the root of these disparities, manifesting via racially segregated care, low Medicaid reimbursement, and a lack of livable wages for staff. 6 out of 10 are melanated, along with other policies and processes that exacerbate disparities. This is an issue that is hidden in plain sight in Big Disco, and we'll come back to staff, the lack of livable wages and other manifestations of exploitation for staff towards the end of our time together. Add this to the mix. Racial marginalization compounds the potentially traumatizing experience people with disabilities encounter when attempting to access services. But because they are melanated, their reactions or responses can be misconstrued as being combative, which can lead to their interfacing with a service provider being preempted by arrest or worse. It is shocking and commonplace for a service provider to call the police on a melanated consumer of service because they are exhibiting quote unquote behaviors, because their trauma their response to being treated in a way that's culturally incompetent or being just outright mistreated is being perceived as the problem, as opposed to being seen as a symptom that there is a problem. Unchecked implicit bias, and I'm being very generous by calling all this implicit bias because it's the year 2025, and 2020 was 5 years ago. And if you're watching this, more than likely you've gone through a whole bunch of implicit bias trainings since the murder of George Floyd, and so nothing's implicit anymore. It's all explicit, but I'm being generous right now. Unchecked implicit bias pertaining to racially marginalized consumers, disabled or otherwise, causes disability professionals to see behavior as a problem and not a sign of trauma and or disability. Let's shift gears for a few minutes and we'll come back to all of that, or we'll bring it all together towards the end. Let's talk a little bit about the disability rights movement, or as we call it as it currently stands, the disability carve-outs movement. So a quote that is often articulated in big disco or in the disability rights movement, particularly in the late 20th century. I think people know better than to say things like what I'm about to say or what you're reading if you're looking at the screen. But nevertheless, watching the courage of Rosa Parks as she defiantly rode in the front of a public bus, people with disabilities realize the more immediate challenge of even getting on the bus. That's a quote. You can find it at ilru.org. It's a quote from Mike Oxford, who is the former executive director of the Topeka Independent Living Resource Center. And it's a sentiment that permeates the disability rights movement, in particular the early days of the disability rights movement. And there's a lot to unpack with regards to this sentiment, because what it does is it presents the concern of Black people. Uh, Black people are mad because they had to sit at the back of the bus. And then it counters it with the concern of people with disabilities. People with disabilities can't even get onto the bus. It forgets the fact that Black people can have disabilities too. And it unnecessarily pits two demographics against each other, and invites the receiver of this message to prioritize one group over the other. Not necessary to throw in demographics under the bus, so to speak, in your advocacy efforts for your particular demographic. And when we're talking about the demographic that is the disability population, we have to, of course, keep in mind that anybody can become disabled at any time. And so if we're only in word or in deed advocating for people that are singularly marginalized by disability, forgetting conveniently that Black and brown people can become disabled as well. That is at the core of exacerbating the multiple marginalization that melanated disabled people experience. And then another zinger from the late Judy Heumann: Martin Luther King Jr. didn't march for you. Now, if you try to find this, if you try to Google this, you're not going to find it, because nobody except for me will publicly acknowledge that Judy Heumann used to say this on a regular basis. She said it to me when she was alive. She said it to lots of other Black folks in disability spaces. But but nobody wants to publicly acknowledge that this is a thing that Judy Heumann said. Martin Luther King Jr., by the way, struggled with mental illness, and at one point experienced a period of suicidality. He was a person, whether or not he acknowledged it, whether or not he felt that that there was space for him in the disability community. He was a person that, at least according to the Americans with Disabilities Act, more than likely had a disability himself. So further down the rabbit hole of the disability rights movement and its racism. Um, so systemically speaking, when we talk about rights, as innocuous as it may seem to talk about rights, we're talking about making space for demographics of people that were not taken into consideration when that space was being formulated. And so rights are about, like, after the fact, oops, how do we create a space for these people that we were not taking into consideration when we created the space? How do we accommodate them after the fact? And so when we do that, when we employ that strategy, and that is a strategy that the disability rights movement has employed and continues to employ and will more than likely employ until the whole thing implodes upon itself. Um, the rationale has been we want buy-in. We want buy-in from the powers that be. That would be the legislators, the lawmakers. And so we got to prioritize giving floor time to the people that we perceive as being the most relatable, the most connect-with-able with lawmakers. And so that's going to be white people in wheelchairs, white men in wheelchairs, and white children with developmental disabilities, and their mothers in particular. And so leaders in the disability rights movement have assured the rest of us that, once the rights are extended, that eventually they'll trickle down to the rest of us. But I beg to differ. And I would say that, trickle down rights work about as well as trickle down economics do. And we all know that trickle down economics do not work. I want to go back to Miss Rosa Parks for a second. When the National Adapt organized an action in Detroit, Michigan, which is my hometown, by the way, in 1986, they invited Miss Rosa Parks to participate in that action. And at first she agreed, and then she pulled out. And she was eviscerated by leadership of the disability rights movement for pulling out. And she was seen, there were things that were said about her that I'm not going to repeat right now. There was disrespectful stuff. I'll leave it at that. But the thing is nobody asked her. Nobody from the disability rights movement asked her, what happened? Can you help us to understand what's going on? Because if they had simply done that and did not and not drag her name through the mud, what they would have heard is that there was frustration from Detroiters, and at that time Detroit was all Black, about white disabled people's appropriation of the Black civil rights movement. Now it's generally regarded and openly articulated that the disability rights movement was, quote unquote, inspired by the Black civil rights movement. But when you look at the disability rights movement as far as slogans and approach and all of that, what you'll see is there's a lot of appropriation that happened. And that that deserves its own hour and a half. But it's a thing, and that's super offensive for Black folks. And so Black folks in Detroit were unhappy about that. Um, and and Detroit circa 1986, and I was 6 years old at the time. And so I was born in a town that had been ravaged by the ramifications of white flight. So a lot of frustration there, a lot of warranted frustration. Miss Rosa Parks heard the members of her racial demographic, and she respected that, and she prioritized that, and I applaud her for doing that. And she was eviscerated by leaders of National Adapt et al. For making that decision. Throughout the history of the disability rights movement, up to today and more than likely tomorrow, Black people have struggled to be included. The rationale that was very explicitly articulated back in the day and is more inferred quietly now is that you leave your race at the door. If you're melanated, if you're Black or brown, you leave your race at the door and you focus on disability and everything will be fine. But what if you've acquired a disability as a result of your experience with systemic racism? How do you expect a person to leave big chunks of themselves at the door? Like that's not a thing. Anyhow, this is not me saying that there's just a dearth of melanated presence in the disability rights movement. That's not true. But by and large, up to today, and more than likely will be true tomorrow and the day after that, when you see Black people, when you see melanated people in leadership positions, in positions where there's a degree of visibility within big disco, um, they've gotten there because they played the game. Just as you see this in every other sector. So why would the disability services sector be any different? Come on. And this includes gatekeeping other melanated people out of the movement spaces, out of big disco spaces, because it is hard enough to be a Black person in these kinds of positions, and you don't want competition after you've done all this hard work of I won't say selling out, but making concessions in the interest of having a seat at the table, so to speak. Again, trickle down rights work about as well as trickle down economics do. They make people do ugly things. Every time I do a presentation, and it's in front of an audience, and I talk about the racism that exists in the disability rights movement, there's always that one person that gets up and says, but the Black Panthers fed disabled activists breakfast, and they linked hands and sang kumbaya as they rolled off into the sunset. Yes, thank you to the Black Panthers for being generous enough to serve breakfast to disabled advocates back in the day. That does not negate the accounts of racism that have been articulated within the disability rights movement. It doesn't negate a single thing that I've said, actually. Um, there's a big reason, and like all of these things that I'm talking about right now, hidden in plain sight, big reason why the Black community struggles to view disability as a Black experience. And it goes back to the way that personal care attendants, direct support professionals, caregivers, whatever the name is, the people that are providing that direct assistance in activities of daily living, and doing it for the long-term services and supports or the home and community-based services waiver reimbursement. We're talking about melanated people, melanated women, Black and brown women. 6 out of 10 direct support professionals, that includes certified nursing assistants, by the way, are racially marginalized. Black women in particular. And we're talking about labor, engaging in labor that is strenuous, up to the point of causing disabilities for the person that's engaging in the labor. Assisting aging and disabled people in lifting and bathing, bowel programming, in shifts that can last 12 or more hours a day for a pittance, for no fringe benefits. With little to no access to personal protective equipment. If you think back to COVID, and often are receiving less pay, less compensation, no vacation, no sick time, you know, less pay than a Walmart cashier receives. And this is not me saying that a Walmart cashier should be paid less. Everybody should be paid more. In particular, excuse me, the people that are doing the labor that 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 results in big disco pulling in hundreds of billions of dollars a year. As this work is being done, the people that are doing the work are subjected to name calling, accusations of theft, neighbors calling the police to report them for trespassing, people calling ICE if the worker looks like they are an immigrant, microaggressions from the agencies that employ them. And then in the midst of all of this, a lack of validation of the experience, because we're talking about mistreatment at the hands of people with disabilities, at the hands of people who are aging or both. And we as a society are generally dismissive of accountability to people with disabilities because we think they just can't help it. And all of this is rooted in enslavement in this country. The inconvenient truth that nobody wants to say out loud. The quiet thing said out loud is that the vocation, the profession, the job of caregiving in this country is intimately linked with the enslavement of Black people. And so, if there's a Black disability experience in this country, until recently, that experience has actually been of adjacency, of providing servitude to white people who are aging or disabled or infirm in some way. Because Black women have been assisting white people in the activities of daily living in their homes for as long as Black people have been here. For as long as Black people were wrenched from the African continent and dragged over here to be enslaved. And so since 1619, effectively, Black women have been assisting white people in toileting, bathing, grooming, dressing, wet nursing, cleaning, cooking, and other domestic tasks. And then, even after 1865, the pay has been exploitive. It remains exploitive to this day. And then there's the racist abuse. There's the misogynoir, which is the intersection of anti-Blackness and sexism, for those of you who don't know what that is. At the hands of white people who are, vulnerable and dependent upon the care of the Black women who are providing that care in the midst of all of this, all of this trauma, all of this mistreatment, all of this disrespect. And then, pertinent to these uncertain times, a third of the workforce that provides in-home long-term care to aging and disabled people are people that are immigrants. So going back to speaking about systemic racism in a more global way as far as Big Disco is concerned, it permeates everything. It permeates disability research, disability policy, disability education, disability advocacy, disability advising, disability services and supports. Your understanding of disability, even if you yourself are a disabled person, systemic racism impacts your perception of disability, even if you are a melanated person with a disability. It impacts me. And I think I'm, one of two people in this country that is still banging the drum about this stuff. Even my perception of disability is skewed by systemic racism. We have all been conditioned by Big Disco, by mainstream media, to perceive disability in very specific ways for very specific reasons. And one of those reasons, just to put it out there, is if we start focusing, if Big Disco were to, by some miracle, wake up tomorrow and say, we're going to focus on all the disability issues. Well, the fear is that, the money that flows in and around Big Disco would start flowing to these things, and it would flow away from the things that it's currently flowing away from. And we can't have that, can we? Nevertheless, some disability issues that need more than the Americans with Disabilities Act to address effectively. They need money. They need talent. They need acknowledgement. The preschool to prison pipeline, foster care. Foster care. So, fun fact, I aged out of the foster care system. I'm here to tell you that the vast majority of foster homes are group homes. They are congregate settings, folks. Food insecurity, police violence, homelessness, systemic racism, again, trauma. But not only are we not focusing on these things, what's happening 35 years after the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, is that the ADA is being weaponized. And so for those of you that are listening along, I've got some screen grabs of a few news articles. The first one, pending increased removal of sidewalk camps, ADA settlement approved by Portland City Council, that liberal bastion in the Pacific Northwest. Second heading, Sacramento faces class action disability lawsuit over homeless camps blocking sidewalks. So, according to Easter Seals, over 40% of homeless people in this country have a disability. And so what are we doing here? We're using the Americans with Disabilities Act against, more than likely, disabled people. So you got disabled people who have the privilege of benefiting from the ADA, knocking people who have disabilities and are homeless upside the head with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Make it make sense. So that kind of disability advocacy that is inclusive of the weaponization of the Americans with Disabilities Act, a lot of times what you'll see is, that's the result of advocacy efforts that are spearheaded by disability rights organizations, protection and advocacy agencies, et cetera, et cetera. And so the question begs, does the typical, excuse me, disability rights organization that advocates for the inclusion of disabled people struggle with their own internal inclusion issues when it comes to racially marginalized disabled people, disabled or otherwise? Do they struggle with regards to their perception of disability issues out in the community, up to the point where they're using the ADA to as a weapon against people that are homeless, a strong plurality of whom are people who have disabilities? And the answer is yes. And I say this because if you think back to the Biden administration, after the administration very quickly shifted from a commitment to rooting out systemic racism to a reversion to back to diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, disability organizations jumping at the opportunity to throw their hat in the ring, so to speak, not to address their own diversity, equity, and inclusion gaps within the spaces of big disco as far as racially marginalized people, but to instead advocate for the inclusion of an A at the end of DEI, so that people with disabilities could get in on the Biden year incentives pertaining to DEI. Now we're in the Trump administration, and Big Disco has quietly removed the A from DEI because the milk and honey of DEI stopped a flowing, and DEI is being basically criminalized at this point. And the argument from Big Disco is that disability is not a controversial identity. And so if you've got organizations that are operating with that mindset, and you're looking to those organizations for intel as far as the inclusion of people with disabilities is concerned, at best that intel is going to be incomplete. At best, my God. So what about disability justice influencers and organizations, right? Okay, well, disability rights rights are about making space for people after the fact. So certainly justice is better, right? Certainly disability justice people are doing what needs to be done. Okay, so few questions. Does the disability justice influencer or organization you have in mind, do they talk about racism in a manner that focuses it on how it manifests in hashtag Big Disco? Do they bring attention to the systemic barriers within hashtag Big Disco that melanated people experience in their attempts to access home and community-based services? That big moneymaker for hashtag Big Disco? Do they shine a light on the racism, the misogynoir, the exploitation that direct support professionals experience within Big Disco? Do they do anything that disrupts the hashtag Big Disco status quo? Or do they speak about things like systemic racism in an overarching general sense and advocate for inclusion of melanated disabled people in leadership positions within Big Disco? Do they do anything, say anything with regards to there being no reforms that can be made for an oppressive system, and that the system has to be dismantled? Or do they advocate for their inclusion in decision-making roles in the oppressive system? These are questions to consider as you are thinking about the disability justice people, places, and things that you are privy to. Okay. In closing, because I see I've been talking for almost 90 minutes. My God. So what we talked about in 2020, dismantling the system, lots of people made promises about that. Yeah, I know that it's not du jour to talk about that kind of stuff anymore, but the fact of the matter is that the oppressive system is unsustainable. That you can't unsee it. Attempts to reform the oppressive system, which is what we saw happening in the Biden administration, by making it more diverse, equitable, and inclusive, will only incite backlash, leading to efforts to restore the oppressive system to its original factory settings. This is literally what is happening right now. Right now, the current administration is working to undo all of the DEI stuff, all of the liberal initiatives to reform the system. They're undoing it all. They're restoring it to its original factory settings. It's what's happening right now. I'm repeating myself. I'm on the autism spectrum. And this is my focus. This is my area of focus. Rights can be revoked at any time. It happens all the time. It's happening right now. And it is impractical at best to to expect that we're going to do this. The system giveth, the system taketh away. We advocate, it giveth, it taketh away. We advocate, it giveth, it taketh away. This is ludicrous. This is not the way it should be. It's expensive. It leaves behind millions of people, and it's not working. And yet, hashtag big disco, in response to the threat of the revocation of rights or the actual revocation of rights, what we've seen for the past generation now, for at least the bulk of the 21st century, is a shifting of the disability rights movement into the disability carve-outs movement. And efforting to ensure that between 5 and 10% of people who are tapped into home and community-based services, that their lives are impacted as little as possible, as the rights are extended and the rights are taken away. Big Disco's primary focus is, frankly, ensuring that funding is not interrupted, and so making sure that the consumers of the services that are being reimbursed by that funding, that their lives are not being disrupted by the revocation of rights and that kind of thing. And so the focus is on how do we carve them out when the shit's about to hit the fan. Texas versus Becerra, now Texas versus Kennedy. Throw trans people under the bus politely so that we can make sure that the default setting of big disco is not impacted by any shifting as far as the Rehabilitation Act is concerned. Big disco must be held accountable for the systemic racism it perpetuates. Right now, it's the Lois Curtis Center in Topeka, Kansas. Itty bitty little Lois Curtis Center is the only thing out there, trying to shine a light on the fact that, there are a lot of ramifications for not holding Big Disco accountable for the systemic racism that it perpetuates. There are millions of people with disabilities who end up homeless, in jail, or dead prematurely because they simply cannot overcome the barriers that are rooted in systemic racism that exist within Big Disco. Big Disco must be held accountable for the systemic racism it perpetuates. Melanated people who are disabled are criminalized in this country, while at the same time, their white disabled counterparts are exempted from accountability because of disability. This disparity has to be confronted because when you exempt somebody from accountability, you are infantilizing them. And I thought that people with disabilities didn't want to be infantilized. Well, this would be a really powerful way of ensuring that that's not happening. Also, if we continue to criminalize melanated people with disabilities, including melanated kids with disabilities, we are about to we're about to encounter a new stop on the preschool to prison pipeline in this country. Those wellness camps that RFK Jr. Has been talking about for a while now. He is this HHS secretary. He is in a prime position to bring those into fruition. Again, if you don't want to infantilize people with disabilities, if you are a white person with a disability and you don't want to be infantilized, well, then that means that you want to be held accountable. And you don't want to be exempted from accountability when it comes to engaging in racist behavior and other manifestations of abusive behavior. Big Disco is a hotbed of drama and trauma because there's no accountability for bad behavior. I could go on about that, but the vast majority of hashtag Big Disco's revenue is generated on the backs of melanated women who are financially exploited, harassed, subjected to hostile workspaces in exchange for assisting people with disabilities with their activities of daily living. They're just trying to do their jobs. They deserve more than a pizza party and a swag bag for their efforts. Their experiences, however, are largely overlooked because of the reticence to hold hashtag Big Disco, as well as people with disabilities, and I'll throw aging people in the mix as well, accountable for bad behavior. Your silence about this, if you are a stakeholder in Big Disco in one way, shape, or form, and you're silent about this, then that is you giving your consent for it to continue. Last slide, folks. No action steps. We don't do action steps at the Lois Curtis Center because, and as a person that used to do a lot of DEI training, seminars, whatever, I know that people want that last slide to be 10 easy steps that they can go out into the world and engage in, to show that they're a good ally or whatever. No, because I stopped doing action steps in 2022 because between 2020 and 2022, I gave action steps. I read lots of statements of solidarity. I was privy to lots of promises that were made to the Black community in this country. And what happened to all of that stuff? I mean, if you really want an action step, then go dig up the promises that you made to Black people in 2020. And the promises that you didn't fulfill, well, fulfill them. Don't add new action steps. You haven't completed the ones you made in 2020. Anyhow, everybody knows what needs to be done. Dismantle the system. And the thing is if you're like, yeah, but I want action steps, it's because you want to not dismantle the system because that's so big and huge and inconvenient and oh my gosh. And so, let me fixate on the action steps. Yeah, look, there are tons of people out there that still purport to do DEI trainings and stuff, and they've got action steps. We just don't do them at the Lois Curtis Center. Here's one though. If you really want an action step, start talking about systemic racism inside of hashtag Big Disco and stop remaining silent out of a misplaced sense of loyalty. That's that. Just start with that. You know, be willing to do that. Be willing to connect the dots and see the picture, so to speak. LoisCurtis.org is our website, and it is over 90 minutes. I want to thank those of you who either tuned in live or are watching this recording at a later day time. Um, Catch up with us on social media. And if you're interested in supporting our mission, again, LoisCurtis.org, variety of ways to do that. You can donate. You can subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Um, just speak, acknowledge, affirm that systemic racism within hashtag Big Disco is a thing. Don't let us be the only ones that are articulating this message. We thank you for your time.